I'm Brian McCreath at GBH in Boston with Tony Solitro, the composer of Canción Exaltada. Tony, thanks for a little bit of your time today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Canción Exaltada is a joyful piece. It's a really beautiful, beautiful piece of music. But you say that it's to Julia de Burgos, Puerto Rican poet from the early 20th century, I think, if I have that right.
Correct.
And I think that I want to ask you first about that rather than about the title itself. I want to ask you about Julia de Burgos, her poetry, your experience of it, and how it led you to connect it to this particular piece.
Well, I was familiar with her poetry before in passing, but hadn't spent a lot of time reading all of her poetry. And when Tian told me about this project, I didn't quite know what was going on, but he said that the first year of this project was going to be about Puerto Rico and to write a proposal. I immediately thought of Julia and her poetry that meant a lot to me and spent some time reading it and just even marked off some poems that stood out to me and didn't realize until later that they had some commonalities. So then I put together a proposal that was about an homage to Julia, but also I think what she as an artist says directly to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And so Julia de Burgos is not a poet that I'm particularly familiar with. And it sounds like you were before this project even was part of your life. So describe a little bit about her, and I'm sure there's a range of her poetry that people could sort of categorize and analyze, whatever. But what are the kinds of poems that she's written overall that speak most to you? What is it she's writing about that connect most closely to you?
The ones that I was noticing spoke most to me were the ones where it seemed like she was talking about herself, but she was also giving me advice about how to be an artist in the world. But also she was, a champion of social causes and believed in feminism and wanted society to be better, and she wanted the workers of the world to unite. And so even though the poems might be talking about bigger ideas, the fact that they were so full of joy was something that I was responding a lot to, and something that I find difficult. When the world is hurting, it's sometimes very difficult to tap into that joy. And so she can be talking about oppression, and she can be talking about workers that aren't respected, and yet her call to them is a joyful one. And so that meant a lot to me at the time and as I was working on the piece.
And I think it shows up in the piece. I think that the piece really does reflect that. So tell me, I'm always fascinated when composers are inspired by a non-musical sort of entity or inspiration or artwork. And I wonder how you begin that process of taking the essence of a poem, or poems, in this case perhaps, and making that into music. What do you draw from for the sounds that you're going to put down on paper first and then hear from the instruments?
There's a couple different answers to that. I write a lot of vocal music, and so there are melodies that are settings of text. Even though nobody's singing the text, I still connect it to specific lines from a poem and as I would do with vocal music, I'm trying to take that text and lift it up. And so it's fun to also do that, but you don't know what the text is as an audience member.
That I have to confess, that is an idea that is so simple and straightforward and yet so completely not obvious to me. I don't know why it wouldn't have been obvious to me, but sure, you have poems. Why not set the music to the poem, but then just remove the words and you have the beginnings of your music.
And just the rhythm of the language is really beautiful. So it led me to create melodies that I might not otherwise have created because I was responding to the syntax of the language and the rhyme scheme, which, has its musical correlations.
Now, you say that that Julia de Burgos and her poems led you to this piece, this very energetic, very joyful piece. And I wonder, as you worked on the piece and as you were involved with Tian and El Puerto Rico, what you feel like you may now know that you didn't know before about Puerto Rico, about the Puerto Rican experience, spending time with the musicians, with the other composers. Tell me if there is anything that you feel like you've gained in your sense of Puerto Rico through this entire experience.
Well, I would say that mostly my engagement has been with Julia, who is writing about wanting nationalism in Puerto Rico, and so the fact that her ideas were very radical at the time, and now some of her radical ideas are widely accepted, I think that is what I took out of it most, is that it's evolving, and that sometimes ideas that we might be frustrated with right now, like why can't people catch on, will eventually, hopefully, come to be.
Sure. Now, in musical terms, you mentioned that you write a lot of vocal music. I wonder if this is the first time you have written for this specific ensemble, for this specific arrangement, what they call the Pierrot arrangement of instruments from Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire. But is this the first chance that you've had to explore this particular combination?
Without voices, yes.
Yeah, okay.
So I've written for this ensemble, but as accompaniment to operatic pieces. But this is the first time there's no vocal component to it.
Okay. The title, Canción Exaltada, makes one almost think there might be a vocal component. I don't know if you've thought of transforming parts of this music into vocal music, especially given how you describe the generation of some of the musical material. Has that occurred to you?
I think that would be a different piece, but one that I would love to write.
Okay.
This one won't have singers.
Yeah. With this ensemble, which on the surface, when you look at a description of a Pierrot ensemble, it seems very spare. It seems that you only have these few solo instruments. A piano and percussion add a lot, but still you're dealing with a small number of musicians. And yet your piece seems to build texture and energy in layers, and you seem to get a lot out of very few players. Is that something that we would find in other pieces of music that you've written, or is that the what you try to achieve in most of your music in general?
Every piece is a little different.
Sure.
But I would say that I have a tendency to want an orchestra no matter how many instruments I'm writing for. And so to get, a big string sound just from two string players and to make them sound like a string orchestra supported with the other instruments around them is a challenge I delight in.
Yes, well, and I think I can tell that from the music. I think that's one of the things about Canción Exaltada that I really love. That I think the listener can sense that, not just the joy of the piece itself, but I think that upon listening to it, a listener would hear what you love in these instruments.
And I also love asking them to sing. So
Yes.
Every instrument is a singer, and so even percussion melodies and piano tunes, there's a lot of cantabile in there.
Yeah. One final question: with this project now in the studio, it's a little bit of a culmination for El Puerto Rico, and I wonder the experience of working with Tian, with these musicians, in the community with these other composers. which is of course only occasional when people come together. But nevertheless, you've been in communication with these people over the course of a few years now. Has it led to a change or new ideas that you'll take to a new project that you might be considering coming up?
Well, the process for this was a lot of fun and different for me. That first summer that I worked with Tian and the musicians, I came in with little excerpts that were maybe 30 seconds to 90 seconds, and each one had its own character or idea or responded to a different poem. And I gave myself permission not to worry about what order they were going to go in or how they all fit together. And so then after that experience, going away to write and now knowing the musicians and writing for them specifically, it helped me to gather ideas in a way that I otherwise may not have. And so what I ended up finding was a narrative in the poems. And so the first one that you hear in the piece is about a voice that's awakening and emerging. And I like to think of this as both Julia's voice, my voice as an artist, but also, the voice of a people that are coming together and finding their voice. Then the middle section is a joyful protest chant. And so again, I think that it's Julia finding her way to protest the things that upset her, but also calling on workers of the world to unite and such. And then it ends with a question, a more introspective, we're artists, we have small voices, what can we do? And also just as people who care about our communities and our world, what can one voice do? Is the question mark that I leave it with. But hopefully a hopeful ending.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Tony Solitro, thank you so much for the music and for talking with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.